And the good work, we could go back earlier than this, but the first express attempt or work or program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions started in 1997, a little more than 20 years ago now, and that has some personal meaning for me. I worked on the work group that established that standard. It was the first in the United States to set a CO2 standard for siting new power plants, and it's really been a model for many other states. The legislature followed that with a significant step in 1999, not directly related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but which has had an effect, which is the public purpose charge on our electric bills, which funds energy conservation and renewables. Then in 2007, as we've heard already, the legislature set goals for greenhouse gas reduction. The legislature also adopted the initial renewable portfolio standard in that year, as well as establishing the Oregon Global Warming Commission. In 2009, there was action by the Environmental Quality Commission to adopt California's zero-emission vehicle standards, and I want to dwell on this for a moment because of the importance of the emissions coming from our transportation sector in particular. As you've read in the media recently, California has authority under federal law to adopt emission standards that are different from federal emission standards, and states are able to adopt either the federal standards or the California standards. So back well before 2009, California began to adopt zero-emission vehicle standards and low-emission vehicle standards. Oregon opted into those standards, and they're now a significant part of the existing controls that we have on emissions from the transportation sector. If we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, there are basically three ways to do it. One is by improving mileage for vehicles that use traditional fossil fuels. Another technique, which I'll talk about in a second, is reducing vehicle miles traveled, the amount we drive. And the third, which I'll also talk about in a second, is to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. Oregon is working on all three of those. That's the good news. The bad news is we're still seeing some increase in transportation sector GHG emissions. So moving on then, in 2010, the Oregon legislature adopted the Sustainable Transportation Initiative as part of a significant transportation funding package that was adopted that year. And under that program, the Portland metro area, along with some other larger metropolitan areas in the state, have been working to reduce their vehicle miles traveled, that second leg of the three legs of the stool. And then in 2012, Oregon began the Clean Fuels Program, which the legislature took further action on in the last long session in 2017. And then, again, another important action in 2016 legislatively, the Coal to Clean legislation, which requires our utilities to not rate base any electricity from the production by coal starting in 2030, and then an update to our renewable portfolio standard to get to 50% renewables by 2040. And then finally, in another, again, as part of a major transportation initiative, this time in 2017, the legislature enacted a rebate program for accelerating the introduction of electric vehicles into Oregon. Again, an important part of the three-legged stool of reducing transportation GHG emissions. So a lot of activity in Oregon. We've done a lot. Some of these programs really are still groundbreaking national